Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm 74 years old, and until last Sunday I believed I understood exactly where I stood in my own family. Then my brother Robert looked me in the eye at a table full of people who share my blood and told me I had never accomplished anything in my life. He said it smiling, the way a man mentions the weather, certain nobody would push back. What he did not know, what nobody at that table knew, was that the day before I had walked out of a title office here in Dayton, Ohio, holding a deed with only one name printed on it, mine. I want to tell you how I got there, because it did not happen in one afternoon, and it did not happen out of anger. It happened slowly, the way water wears down a stone, over 60 years of being the daughter who stayed quiet, the sister who never argued, the woman everyone assumed would just accept whatever was decided for her. Have you ever sat at a table where people talked about your life like you were not in the room? If you have, you already know the particular kind of tired that comes from being underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you best. Before I go further, if this story feels familiar to you, hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it helps this little channel keep going. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. My name before I married was Dorothy Whitman. I grew up in a small craftsman bungalow on Sycamore Lane in a neighborhood called South Park, one of the older parts of Dayton, the kind of place with big porches and oak trees that have been there longer than any of us. My father, Harold, worked 31 years at the machine tool plant on the east side. My mother, Frances, kept that house spotless and stretched every dollar he brought home until it could not stretch any further. Robert is a year older than me. From the time we were children, he was the one people noticed first, taller, louder, quicker with an answer, and I was the quiet one who read books on the porch swing and did not mind being second. I became an elementary school teacher, third grade mostly, for 32 years at the same school district, teaching children to read and to be kind to each other, and I loved almost every single day of it. Robert went a different way. He got into commercial real estate right out of college, and by the time he was 40, he was developing strip malls and office parks all over the Miami Valley. He and his wife Diane built a big Tudor-style house in Oakwood, one of the nicest suburbs around here, and he drives a black Cadillac Escalade that he trades in every 2 years. I am not telling you this with any bitterness. I am telling you so you understand the gap that existed at that family table long before anyone said a cruel word out loud. I want you to picture it properly, because the contrast matters for everything that comes later. Robert's house in Oakwood sits on a street lined with mature maples, a stone walkway leading up to double front doors, a 3-car garage that houses his Escalade alongside Diane's Lexus, and a boat he takes out on the lake maybe twice a summer. My house on Sycamore Lane has a gravel driveway that still needs regrading, a porch swing that squeaks in a way I have grown fond of, and a kitchen with the same laminate countertops my mother chose in 1983. Neither house is a judgment on the person who lives in it, not really, but in my family, for as long as I can remember, the size of a house had somehow become confused with the size of a person's worth. And nobody ever seemed to notice that confusion happening except me. My husband Frank and I lived a modest life. He drove a delivery route for 30 years, and I taught, and we raised 2 children. And when he passed 6 years ago from a heart condition, I moved back into my parents' old house on Sycamore Lane to care for my mother in her last years. When she passed, 3 years ago now, she left that house to Robert and me equally, in what the lawyer called a tenancy in common, meaning we each owned an undivided half. Not the kind of ownership where one person automatically gets the whole thing if the other passes. I kept living there. It felt right. It was the house where I learned to walk, the house where my mother taught me to bake bread, and Robert never once objected to me staying, not out loud anyway. For 3 years that arrangement felt settled, or so I believed. Robert would visit sometimes, mention offhand that the neighborhood was changing, that a brewery had opened 2 streets over, that young families were paying real money for houses like ours now. I did not think much of it at the time. I thought he was just making conversation, the way successful men do, always noticing value in things. I did not understand yet that he was watching that house the way a man watches a stock he intends to sell, waiting for the right moment, and that, in his mind, my half of it was simply an inconvenience he would eventually need to work around, one way or another. The comments started small, almost too small to notice at first. At Thanksgiving, Robert would mention some deal he had closed downtown and then glance at me and say something like, "Well, not everybody needs to worry about that kind of thing." At Diane's birthday dinner, when I mentioned I was thinking of updating the kitchen, Robert laughed and said I should ask him before spending money on a house I did not fully understand the value of. I let it go. That is what you do when you are the younger sister who was raised to keep the peace. I told myself he did not mean anything by it, that success sometimes makes people forget their manners without meaning any real harm. I remember one particular dinner very clearly, a rainy October evening at Robert's house. The smell of Diane's pot roast filling that big dining room while rain tapped against the windows. I had mentioned quietly that I was thinking of putting new gutters on the house before winter. Nothing more than a small practical comment, the kind you make between passing the green beans and asking someone to refill your water glass. Robert set down his fork and asked in front of everyone whether I had actually gotten 3 estimates or just called the first company in the phone book, the way I always do things. Nobody laughed loudly. It was worse than that. A few of them chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that tells you the comment was expected, familiar, already part of how this family understood me. I smiled along with it because that is what you learn to do, but I remember pressing my thumbnail into the pad of my finger under the table, hard enough to leave a small mark, just so I would have something else to feel besides that particular kind of small. But underneath those small comments, something else was happening, something I would not fully understand until much later. I started noticing folded papers in places they should not have been. I started getting phone calls meant for someone else. I started feeling, in that quiet way you feel weather changing before the sky actually darkens, that my family had begun making decisions about my life without including me in the room where those decisions were being made. And the worst part was not the decisions themselves. The worst part was realizing that, in their eyes, I had never really been in the room to begin with, not once, not in 74 years. I used to lie awake some nights running a strange kind of arithmetic in my head, counting up everything I actually had accomplished, as if I needed the evidence filed away somewhere in case anyone ever asked me to defend myself. 32 years teaching third graders to read, which meant, by my own rough count, somewhere near 900 children who could sound out a hard word because of a lesson I planned at my kitchen table late at night. A marriage of 41 years to a good, steady man who never once raised his voice at me. 2 children raised decently, both of them kind, both of them employed, neither of them in trouble with the law or with their own consciences. A mother cared for through her final illness without a single paid nurse because I did that myself, every difficult night of it. None of it showed up on a balance sheet the way Robert's office buildings did, and I was beginning to understand that, in this family, if it did not show up on a balance sheet, it was treated as though it had never happened at all. Let me tell you about the spring when things started shifting, because it matters for understanding what came later. In April, I helped Robert after his knee replacement surgery, driving him to physical therapy 3 times a week since Diane was still working, and their son Kevin lives across town. I did not mind. That is what family does, I thought. You show up when someone needs help getting from the car into a building, even if that someone has spent years making you feel small at holiday dinners. I brought him soup. I picked up his prescriptions. I sat with him during the boring afternoons of recovery, and for those few weeks I let myself believe we were closer than we had been in years. There's something particular about caring for a sibling's body after decades of feeling small around them. Watching a man who once seemed larger than life wince putting weight on a swollen knee, needing your arm to steady himself getting out of a car. I remember one afternoon in his kitchen, warming soup on Diane's expensive range, while Robert sat at the island complaining about the physical therapist. And for just a moment, stirring that pot slowly, I felt something almost like tenderness toward him, the kind you feel toward anyone reduced by pain to their most human size. I told myself, foolishly perhaps, that maybe this stretch of needing me would soften something between us permanently, that maybe gratitude would finally settle the score 60 years of small comments had built up between us without either of us ever naming it out loud. It was during one of those drives that I first saw it, though I did not understand what I was seeing at the time. A folder in the back seat of his Escalade, thick with a business card clipped to the front. The name on the card said Todd Greer, and underneath it, Cornerstone Realty Group. I thought nothing of it. Robert dealt with real estate people constantly. That was his whole career. So a business card in his car meant about as much as a napkin from a restaurant. I helped him inside, made him comfortable, and drove home to Sycamore Lane, back to my quiet house with my quiet garden, with no idea that folder had anything to do with the walls around me. Looking back now, I can recall the exact texture of that afternoon with a clarity that almost frightens me. The vinyl seat of Robert's Escalade still warm from the sun, the faint smell of new leather, the folder's corner just barely visible in the rearview mirror as I backed out of his driveway. I remember thinking quite plainly that Todd Greer was an unusual name for a person, the kind of name you might forget by dinner, and I did forget it, or told myself I had, tucking it away in some drawer of memory I did not open again until weeks later, when it would matter more than I could have imagined, sitting in that driveway with the radio playing softly and my brother wincing beside me from his surgery. A few weeks later, at a Sunday dinner at Diane's house, Robert's son, Kevin, made an offhand comment that stuck with me longer than he probably intended. He mentioned that his father had been, quote, working on something with the old house, and Diane shot him a look across the table, the kind of look that tells you a conversation is supposed to stop right there. I asked casually, "What kind of something?" Robert waved his hand and said it was nothing, just exploring options, nothing I needed to worry my head about. Worry my head about? As if the house I had lived in for 3 years, the house with half my name on the deed, was a math problem too complicated for me to be trusted with. I drove home from Diane's that night with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than the road required, replaying Kevin's sentence over and over, working on something with the old house until the words lost their shape the way any phrase does when you repeat it too many times in your own head. I did not turn on the radio. I did not want noise. I wanted to sit with that discomfort long enough to understand exactly what it was telling me, because 60 years of being the quiet one had taught me that discomfort like that rarely arrives without a reason worth taking seriously, even when everyone around you insists you are imagining things. I want you to understand something about being 74 and being spoken to that way. It is not the words themselves that cut the deepest. It is the tone underneath them. The assumption baked so deep into a person's voice that they don't even realize they're doing it. The assumption that because you taught third graders instead of closing commercial deals, because you drove a Honda instead of an Escalade, you must not be capable of understanding your own life. I sat at that table smiling, passing the mashed potatoes, while some small cold feeling settled into my stomach and stayed there for the rest of the evening, a feeling I could not yet name, but would come to understand very clearly before the summer was over. I finished clearing the table that night the way I always did, rinsing plates, wrapping leftovers, moving through the motions of a good sister and a good aunt, while something cold settled deeper into my chest with every dish I stacked. Diane thanked me at the door, the way she always does, and hugged me a little longer than usual, and I remember wondering, standing on her porch in the cool evening air, whether that extra second of holding on meant she already knew more than she was letting herself say out loud. I drove the 20 minutes back to Sycamore Lane in silence, past the new brewery with its string lights glowing over the patio, past the young families walking dogs on streets that used to belong only to people like my parents. And I let myself feel, just for those 20 minutes, exactly how alone a person can be inside a family that claims to love her. 2 nights after that dinner I could not sleep, so I sat in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out at the backyard, where my mother used to grow tomatoes, and I let myself think honestly about what I had noticed. The folder in Robert's car, the look Diane gave Kevin, the word options. None of it proved anything terrible on its own, but together it formed a shape, the way scattered stars form a constellation once you know where to look. I decided, sitting there in the dark with my tea going cold, that I would pay closer attention, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a feeling that had served me well for 74 years. The feeling that something was being kept from me on purpose. I decided that week to become, quietly, a different kind of person than the one my family had always assumed I was. I began keeping a small notebook in my kitchen drawer, the same drawer where my mother used to keep her recipe cards, and I started writing down dates, small comments, anything that felt slightly out of place. It felt almost silly at first, an old woman jotting down grievances like a child keeping score. But Patricia would tell me later that this quiet habit, this small, unglamorous discipline of paying attention and writing it down, was exactly the kind of thing that eventually made all the difference. I did not tell a soul what I was doing. I simply watched my own family more closely than I had allowed myself to in years, and I waited for the next piece to fall into place. The following week, the phone call came, the one that would end up mattering more than any conversation at any dinner table. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in my garden pulling weeds around the rose bushes my mother planted decades ago, when my cell phone rang with a number I did not recognize. A pleasant young woman on the line asked to confirm she was speaking with Dorothy Whitman, co-owner of the property at 214 Sycamore Lane. She said she was calling from Miami Valley Title, following up on a closing scheduled for later that month, and she wanted to confirm the contact information on file was still current. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up to why. I asked her as calmly as I could manage what closing she was referring to, because as far as I knew, there was no closing scheduled on my house. There was a long pause on her end, the kind of pause that tells you someone realizes they have said something they were not supposed to say. She apologized, said there must have been some confusion and that she would have someone call me back with clarification. Nobody called me back that day. Nobody called me back the next day either. And in that silence, in that carefully constructed nothing, I understood something had been set in motion behind my back, something involving my house, my name, and apparently a closing date that already existed somewhere on a calendar I had never seen. I stood there in my garden for a long while after that call ended, the phone still in my hand, my knees pressed into the dirt beside the rose bushes. And I noticed, in that strange way your mind fixes on small details during a shock, that a ladybug had landed on my wrist, and I did not brush it away. The late afternoon light was turning gold across the yard, the way it does in early summer, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's sprinkler was ticking against a fence, ordinary sounds from an ordinary Tuesday, while inside my chest something had gone very still and very cold. I remember thinking, almost calmly, that whatever was happening, I was not going to fall apart in my own tomato patch over it. I was going to go inside, wash the dirt from my hands, and think. That night I barely slept at all. I lay in my old bedroom, the same room I slept in as a girl, staring at the ceiling and turning the conversation over and over in my mind. Co-owner of the property. A closing scheduled. Someone had listed information for me somewhere, perhaps as what they call a backup contact, never imagining I would actually pick up that phone myself. I thought about Robert's folder, about Todd Greer's business card, about Kevin's comment and Diane's warning look, and slowly, painfully, piece by piece, the way a jigsaw puzzle finally reveals its picture once enough of the edges lock into place, the picture assembled itself into something I did not want to see but could no longer pretend I hadn't seen. My own brother was trying to sell the house out from under me, and somewhere in his plan, my signature was required, and he intended to get it without me ever truly understanding what I was signing. Somewhere around 3 a.m, unable to lie still any longer, I got up and walked barefoot down to the kitchen, and I stood in the doorway of what used to be my parents' bedroom, empty now except for a cedar chest and my mother's old sewing machine. I thought about my father coming home from the machine tool plant every evening for 31 years, tired in a way that lived in his shoulders, and how he never once, not a single time, made my mother feel like she did not understand their own household finances, even though he was the one earning the paycheck. I thought about my mother teaching me to make bread at that same kitchen counter, her hands guiding mine through the kneading, telling me that a woman who can feed a family and balance a checkbook has already accomplished more than most people manage in a lifetime. I stood there a long time in the dark, drawing strength from 2 people who were no longer alive to give it to me directly. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters beyond just my own story. Have you ever discovered that people who claim to love you have been making plans that reshape your entire life without ever once asking your opinion, because in their minds, your opinion simply did not carry enough weight to include? It is a particular kind of loneliness, realizing that the family dinner table, the place that should feel safest in the whole world, has actually been a stage where decisions get made in whispers you were never invited to hear. If any part of this is landing close to home for you tonight, please subscribe to this channel. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to an old woman just trying to tell her story honestly. I did not confront Robert that week. I want to be honest with you about why. Part of it was fear, plain and simple. Fear of being wrong, fear that I had misunderstood an innocent phone call and would embarrass myself accusing my own brother of something terrible. But part of it, the larger part, if I am being truthful, was strategy. 60 years of being underestimated teaches you something valuable if you are paying attention. It teaches you that the quietest person in the room is often the one gathering the most information because nobody bothers watching what the quiet one is doing. I decided I would not say a word yet. I would watch, and I would learn exactly what my brother thought he could get away with. The first person I called was not Robert. It was my oldest friend, Patricia Delgado, a woman I have known since we sang together in the church choir back when our children were still small. Patricia became a real estate attorney later in life, after her own divorce forced her to learn the law the hard way, and over the years she built a reputation around Dayton as someone who does not let people get taken advantage of. I called her on a Wednesday morning, my hands actually shaking as I dialed, and told her everything, the folder, the phone call, the strange silence that followed. She listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she said something I will never forget. She said, "Dorothy, honey, it sounds like your brother thinks you're still 8 years old. Let's find out exactly what he's planning, and then let's make sure he's wrong." Patricia explained something to me that day that changed how I understood my entire situation. Because my mother's will created a tenancy in common, Robert could not legally sell the whole house without my signature, no matter what any buyer or title company assumed. But she also warned me that people find ways around that inconvenience, sometimes through something called a partition action, where a court can force the sale of jointly owned property, even over one owner's objection, and sometimes through something far simpler and far more common, convincing the less informed owner to sign documents they do not fully understand, dressed up in kind language about doing what's best for everyone. She asked me directly, "Has anyone tried to get you to sign anything lately, anything at all, even something that seemed small or routine?" Patricia's office sat above an old hardware store downtown, up a narrow staircase with creaking wooden steps, and there was something comforting about that ordinariness while my whole understanding of my family was quietly rearranging itself. She pulled out a legal pad, the kind with a yellow cover, and drew 2 circles overlapping slightly, explaining that a tenancy in common was not like a marriage where everything simply merges into one. Each owner, she said, tapping her pen against each circle, holds their own separate, sellable, protectable share, and no one, not a brother, not a bank, not a title company, eager to close a deal, can simply erase that share without a signature or a court order. She said the words slowly, watching my face, making sure I actually understood, rather than simply nodding along the way people so often expect an older woman to do out of politeness. I told her about a document Robert had mentioned in passing a month earlier, something he called a limited power of attorney, just for handling paperwork, he had said, just in case something ever needs signing while you're busy with your garden club or your grandkids. At the time, I had brushed it off as Robert being Robert, always trying to simplify things, always assuming he knew better how to run everyone's affairs. Patricia went very quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, that is not paperwork convenience. That is someone trying to get legal authority to sign on your behalf without you fully realizing what you are giving away." She told me not to sign anything, absolutely anything, without her reviewing it first, no matter how small or harmless it seemed. Over the following 2 weeks, Patricia and I worked quietly together, meeting at her office on the days I told my family I was at my book club or running errands. She helped me understand the actual numbers behind my own house for the first time in my life. Not the vague sense of value Robert liked to hint at during dinner conversations, but a real appraisal, conducted properly, showing the Craftsman bungalow on Sycamore Lane was worth $238,000 in the current market. thanks in large part to the new brewery district 2 streets over and the young families moving into South Park who wanted exactly this kind of historic charm. My half of that house, on paper, was worth $119,000. Robert's half was worth exactly the same. What Patricia helped me understand next was the choice sitting in front of me, a choice I had never imagined having the power to make. I could wait and hope my brother's scheme fell apart on its own, or worse, I could wait and eventually get pressured into a partition sale that split us both out of a house that belonged to our whole family's history. Or, Patricia said, leaning forward across her desk with a look I had not seen since we were young mothers plotting how to survive difficult years. I could beat him to it. I could offer to buy Robert's half outright at full fair value before he ever got the chance to force a sale to strangers. I sat with that idea for 3 full days before I called her back and said, "Let's do it." I want to tell you honestly what it cost me to consider this, because it was not simple and it was not easy, even with the numbers making sense on paper. 74 years old, a widow, a retired teacher living on a pension and Social Security, I did not have piles of money sitting around waiting to be spent. What I had was 32 years of careful teaching salary saved into modest certificates of deposit at my credit union, $41,000 from Frank's life insurance policy that I had never touched because it felt like touching his memory somehow, and a small inheritance from my mother that I had kept untouched out of respect. Together with some very careful math Patricia helped me work through, it came to just barely enough, $122,000, enough to cover Robert's half and the closing costs, with almost nothing left over as a cushion. Patricia asked me a question that Wednesday afternoon that I have thought about many times since. She asked, "Dorothy, are you doing this because you want the house or because you want to prove something to your brother?" I told her the truth. I told her I wanted both. And I was not ashamed of wanting both. I wanted to keep the walls that held my mother's kitchen and my father's quiet evenings after work and my own childhood bedroom where I first learned to read. And yes, I wanted, just once in my 74 years, to do something my family could not dismiss, could not explain away, could not pretend, did not require any real capability on my part. Patricia smiled and said that sounded like exactly the right reason to her, and we got to work drafting the offer that same week. I remember sitting across from Patricia's desk that afternoon, watching her type the offer letter with the same brisk competence she brought to everything and feeling something shift quietly inside me. A small, private pride I had not let myself feel in years. Here I was, a retired schoolteacher who had spent decades being told, gently but constantly, that she did not understand money, and I was about to make the single largest financial decision of my life, structured properly, backed by a real appraisal, executed through the correct legal channels without asking a single person's permission. I thought of my third graders back then, how I always told them that being quiet in class did not mean you did not know the answer. Sometimes it just meant you were waiting for the right moment to raise your hand. I finally understood, sitting in that office, that I had been waiting 60 years for my own moment to raise mine. Getting the offer to Robert without tipping my hand too early took careful planning, more careful than anything I had done since organizing my classroom's annual science fair decades ago. Patricia drafted a formal written offer, professional and fair, proposing I purchase Robert's undivided half-interest in the Sycamore Lane property for $119,000. The exact appraised value, structured through the same title company he had apparently already been using without my knowledge, Miami Valley Title. We sent it not directly to Robert, but through a neutral intermediary, so it would arrive as a straightforward business transaction rather than a family confrontation. I did not know at the time we sent it whether he would even respond seriously or whether he would laugh it off the way he laughed off everything I ever suggested. What happened next surprised even Patricia. Robert responded within 4 days, agreeing to the sale almost immediately. And I understood why only after Patricia explained it to me later, sitting back in her office chair and shaking her head slightly at how predictable men like Robert could sometimes be once you understood the exact shape of their blind spots. He had assumed, all along, that I would eventually sign whatever paperwork he put in front of me, without ever truly grasping the value of what I was giving up. So an offer at full fair value probably seemed to him like an unexpected windfall, money for something he believed I did not fully understand the worth of anyway. He never once suspected that I already knew about Cornerstone Realty Group, about Todd Greer, about the closing date already sitting on some calendar at Miami Valley Title. He signed his half away to me, thinking he was the clever one in the room, the one seeing an opportunity nobody else could see. The 4 days waiting for his response felt longer than almost any stretch of time I can remember in my adult life. I kept myself busy weeding the garden, grading nothing because I had not taught in over a decade, reorganizing kitchen cabinets that did not need reorganizing, anything to keep my hands moving while my mind ran through every way this plan could fail. What if he suspected something? What if he called Todd Greer first and pushed the Cornerstone closing forward faster than Patricia expected? What if my own courage simply ran out before the paperwork could catch up to it? Patricia told me during one of my anxious phone calls that week that fear at this stage was not a sign I was doing the wrong thing. It was simply the ordinary cost of doing something that actually mattered, and I have carried that sentence with me ever since. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday, quietly, efficiently, the way Patricia does everything. I remember sitting in that small conference room at Miami Valley Title, the same company that had accidentally called me weeks earlier, signing document after document with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief. Patricia sat beside me the entire time, and when the title officer finally slid the recorded deed across the table, showing my name, Dorothy Callahan, as the sole owner of 214 Sycamore Lane, I had to excuse myself for a moment and step into the hallway because I did not want anyone to see a 74-year-old woman crying happy tears in a title office on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Patricia followed me out into the hallway and stood beside me without saying anything for a moment, just handing me a tissue from her purse the way an old friend does without needing to be asked. She told me quietly that she had closed hundreds of transactions in her career, but very few of them had felt like justice the way this one did, and that she was proud of me, prouder than she had probably ever said out loud in all our years of church choir and book club and raising children in the same neighborhood. I remember the hallway smelled faintly of coffee from a machine near the front desk, and outside the window the ordinary traffic of downtown Dayton moved along like any other Thursday, completely unaware that an old woman's whole sense of herself had just quietly reassembled itself in a title office on the second floor. I drove home that day, with the deed sitting on the passenger seat beside me, and I sat in my driveway for a long while before going inside, just looking at the house. Really looking at it, the porch where I used to read as a girl, the oak tree my father planted the year I was born, the window of the bedroom where my mother took her last breath 3 years earlier. This house had been mine in every way that mattered for my entire life, and now, finally, on paper, in the eyes of the law and the county recorder's office, it was entirely mine as well. I did not tell anyone that day. I made myself a simple dinner that evening, just soup and toast, and I sat at my own kitchen table alone, looking at the recorded deed propped against the sugar bowl like some strange centerpiece, and I let myself laugh quietly, once at the absurdity of it all, an old woman sitting by herself in a farmhouse kitchen, laughing at a legal document because it finally proved something 60 years of family dinners had refused to admit. I let the secret settle quietly into my chest, like a stone finally set down after being carried too long, and I waited because I knew, somehow, that the right moment to speak would arrive on its own, and that when it did I would not need to reach for it. It would simply be there, the way truth usually is once you stop being afraid to let it surface. That right moment arrived exactly 6 days later at a Sunday lunch Diane had organized to celebrate Robert and Diane's 50th wedding anniversary, a milestone the whole family gathered for at their big Tudor-style house in Oakwood. I almost did not go. Part of me wanted to stay home in my quiet house with my quiet secret, avoiding whatever tension might come from sitting across a table from the brother I now legally, financially, and completely outmaneuvered. But something told me I needed to be there, that whatever was going to happen next deserved to happen in front of the whole family, not hidden away in a private phone call where Robert could smooth it over before anyone else understood what had actually occurred. The lunch started pleasantly enough, the way these things always do before they don't. Diane had arranged flowers on the long dining table. Kevin and Amanda were there with their spouses, and Robert sat at the head of the table, looking exactly like a man who believes his life is going precisely according to plan. Somewhere between the roast chicken and the anniversary cake, the conversation drifted, as it so often did at that family's table, toward accomplishments, toward Robert's newest development downtown, toward Kevin's recent promotion, toward the kind of success this family had learned to measure in square footage and closing statements and corner offices with views of the river. And then, without any real warning, Robert turned to me, still smiling that easy smile he has always worn so comfortably, and said the words that started this whole story. He said, "Dorothy, we love you, but let's be honest, you've never really accomplished much in this life, have you? Taught some kids their letters, kept a nice garden, that's about it." The table went quiet, that particular kind of quiet where everyone suddenly finds their napkin very interesting. Kevin's wife glanced at me with something like pity. Diane said Robert's name softly, a small warning, but he waved her off, still laughing lightly, still certain he had simply told an obvious truth nobody in the room would dare contradict. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence stretch, letting him enjoy whatever small satisfaction he was getting from that comment, because I wanted him to feel completely, entirely comfortable before what came next. I even reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, the way you might pause before delivering a lesson to a classroom of children who do not yet know a test is coming. And I noticed Diane watching me with a strange, uncertain expression, as though some part of her sensed the ground shifting beneath that dining room table before anyone else did. And then Robert, riding whatever wave of confidence had carried him that far, made his mistake, the mistake that tied everything together in a way even Patricia had not fully predicted. He turned to Kevin and said, proud, careless, certain I would not understand a word of it, by next month that old house on Sycamore is finally going to be worth something to this family, Cornerstone's closing on it, and once my half clears, we'll figure out something fair for your Aunt Dorothy, too. Don't worry." For one long second, nothing happened at all. The anniversary cake sat between us with its little silver number 50 candle still unlit, Diane's good china catching the afternoon light coming through the bay window, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer beeped twice and nobody moved to answer it. I felt, in that strange suspended second, the entire weight of every dinner table comment I had swallowed for 60 years pressing up against the back of my throat. And I made a conscious choice. The same kind of choice I used to make standing in front of 25 restless third graders to breathe once slowly before I said a single word. Something fair for your Aunt Dorothy, too. Those words landed in that dining room like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched the ripples move across every face at that table. Confusion on Kevin's, sudden alarm on Diane's, and on Robert's face. Nothing yet, no idea at all that he had just revealed in front of his entire family, on his own 50th anniversary, the exact scheme he believed he had kept perfectly hidden from the one person it would hurt the most. I set down my fork very slowly and I reached into my handbag, and I did something I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times over the past 2 weeks, without ever quite believing I would actually have the chance to do it. I placed a set of keys on the table, right beside the anniversary cake, the brass keys to 214 Sycamore Lane, the same keys my father carried for 31 years. And on top of them, I placed a folded copy of the recorded deed, the one with only my name printed across the top. I looked at Robert, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my voice did not shake at all when I spoke. I said, "Robert, that house is not going to Cornerstone Realty Group. That house is not half yours anymore either. I bought your half outright fair value, $119,000, closed yesterday at Miami Valley Title. The house is entirely mine now. It has been for 6 days. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I have ever sat inside of in my entire life. Robert stared at the deed, like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked hard enough. Diane's hand went to her mouth. Kevin looked back and forth between his father and me, clearly trying to understand how his aunt, the quiet one, the one who taught third graders and kept a nice garden, had apparently outmaneuvered a man who had spent 30 years closing commercial real estate deals for a living. I let the silence sit there, unhurried, because I had waited 60 years for a moment like this one, and I was not going to rush through it now that it had finally arrived. Robert finally found words, though they came out smaller than any words I had heard from him in years. He asked how I had known, how I could possibly have arranged something like this without him hearing a single whisper of it beforehand. I told him the truth, plainly, without cruelty in my voice, because I did not need cruelty anymore, not with the deed already sitting on that table. I told him that a woman from Miami Valley Title had called me weeks earlier, confirming a contact she believed belonged to a co-owner named Dorothy Whitman, apparently listed on his file as a backup contact he never expected would actually answer her own phone. His own paperwork, his own careless assumption that I would never notice, that had been the very thread that unraveled his entire plan. I watched that realization move across his face slowly, the way weather moves across an open field, starting as confusion, settling into something closer to embarrassment, and finally arriving at a kind of stunned respect he had never once shown me across 60 years of family dinners. I want you to notice something if you're still listening tonight, because it is the truest lesson buried inside this whole story. The exact scheme Robert built to take my half of that house away from me quietly is the very thing that warned me in time to take his half away instead. He never once imagined I was capable of understanding contracts or appraisals or closing documents, so he never bothered hiding his tracks carefully enough from someone he assumed could not read them anyway. Underestimating people, I have learned, at 74 years old, sitting at that anniversary table is not just unkind, it is dangerous because the people you underestimate are often paying far closer attention than you will ever give them credit for. If any part of what I'm telling you tonight feels like your own life, if you've ever been the quiet one your family assumed did not understand what was happening around her, I want you to know something important. And I want you to really hear it. Quiet does not mean unaware. Gentle does not mean powerless. And if this story is giving you something to think about tonight, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and honestly, it means more to me than you probably realize. An old woman with stories nobody in her own family wanted to hear for most of her life. I did not raise my voice at that table, not once, through the entire exchange. I did not throw the deed at him or storm out or say every cutting thing I'd rehearsed in the shower over the past 2 weeks. Instead, I picked the keys back up off the table, slid them into my handbag, and said quietly that I would still be at Sunday dinners, still be part of this family, still love every single person sitting at that table, but that the house on Sycamore Lane and my own capabilities as a grown woman were no longer open for family discussion or family votes. I finished my slice of anniversary cake in silence, and then I asked Diane gently if she wanted help clearing the plates, the same way I always had. Because dignity, I have learned, does not require you to become someone new. It only requires you to stop apologizing for who you always were. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected in a good way. Robert did not call for 3 days, and I spent those 3 days finishing small projects around the house, painting the porch railing, planting fall mums along the front walk, letting my hands stay busy while I waited to see what kind of man my brother would choose to become now that his sister had proven, in front of the whole family, exactly what she was capable of. When he finally did call, his voice sounded different, smaller somehow, careful in a way it had never been careful with me before. He did not apologize outright, not at first. That is not really how Robert operates, but he asked questions, real questions, about how I had managed the purchase, about the appraisal, about Patricia, questions that told me something had shifted permanently in how he saw me, even if neither of us said so directly out loud. At one point in that call, he went quiet for a long stretch, long enough that I asked if he was still there, and when he spoke again his voice had none of its usual polish. He said he had spent so many years measuring people by what showed up on paperwork that he had forgotten his own sister was a person with a whole private life of competence he had simply never bothered to look for. I did not rush to comfort him. I let that admission sit in the silence exactly as long as it needed to. Diane called separately a few days after that, and she cried on the phone, apologizing for her own silence over the months when she had known, at least partially, what Robert was arranging. I told her I understood, that I did not blame her for staying quiet in a marriage where speaking up against her husband's business decisions was never encouraged. But I also told her, gently and firmly, that I hoped things would be different going forward, that I intended to be included in conversations about my own life from now on, not informed after the decisions had already been made somewhere behind a closed door. Kevin, of all people, was the one who surprised me most. He drove over to Sycamore Lane one Saturday afternoon, unannounced, and sat with me on the porch where I used to read as a girl, and told me, with real feeling in his voice, that watching me place those keys on the table had changed something in how he thought about his own grandmother, about aging, about the assumptions his generation makes about people who taught school instead of closing deals downtown. He asked if he could help me with anything around the house, and I told him yes, actually, the gutters needed cleaning before autumn, and he laughed and came back the following weekend with a ladder. Amanda called me too a few weeks later, from her apartment across the state, her voice careful and a little embarrassed. She told me she had always assumed, without ever really examining the assumption, that her father's version of me was probably close enough to accurate. The sweet aunt who taught school and did not concern herself much with money or business. She said watching me set those keys on the table had made her go back and question a lot of small comments she had heard growing up. Comments about women in the family who married well versus women who merely got by. And she apologized for never once asking me directly what my own life actually looked like from the inside. I told her there was nothing to forgive, that most of us inherit our assumptions from the people who raised us, and the real test is only ever what we do once we notice them. I want to be honest with you about something, because I do not want to pretend this story ended in some perfect fairy tale reconciliation. Robert and I are not the way we were before, and honestly, we were never particularly close to begin with, not in the way some siblings are. There was no dramatic hug in that dining room, no tearful apology delivered on the spot the way it might happen in a movie. Robert simply sat there for a long moment after I spoke, turning the folded deed over once in his hands like he was checking it was real, and then he set it down gently, almost respectfully, and asked Diane in a voice smaller than I had heard from him in decades if there was any more of that anniversary cake left. What changed is not that he suddenly loves me more than he did. What changed is that he no longer speaks to me or about me like a woman incapable of understanding her own affairs. We have dinner sometimes still, at Diane's insistence mostly, and it is polite, respectful, careful, in a new way that suits us both better than the old easy cruelty ever did. The house on Sycamore Lane is entirely mine now, deed recorded, taxes paid, gutters cleaned, and every morning I still sit on that porch with my coffee and look at the same oak tree my father planted the year I was born. Some mornings the neighborhood is so quiet I can hear the brewery, 2 streets over, hosing down its patio for the day, and I think about how strange it is that the very changes in this neighborhood Robert once used as proof the house should be sold are the same changes that now make my mornings on this porch feel a little richer, a little more alive, without costing me a single thing I actually valued. Sometimes I think about that folded document, that phone call from Miami Valley Title, that afternoon in Patricia's office when she asked whether I wanted the house or wanted to prove something. And I realize now the answer was always both, and there was never anything wrong with wanting both. A woman does not need to choose between loving her family and refusing to be erased by them. If you have made it this far in my story, I want to leave you with something practical, something more useful than just a nice feeling. If you are the quiet one in your family, the one everyone assumes does not understand money or contracts or your own worth, please start paying closer attention today, not out of fear, but out of respect for yourself. Find someone like my friend Patricia, someone who will explain the numbers honestly without talking down to you. You are allowed to protect what is yours, even from people who share your last name, especially from people who share your last name if it comes to that. I think about my mother sometimes, standing at that same kitchen counter where she taught me to knead bread, and I wonder what she would say if she could see me now, 74 years old, sole owner of the house she and my father built their whole life around. I like to think she would not be surprised at all, that she always knew there was more steel in her quiet daughter than anyone at that dinner table ever gave me credit for. Maybe that is the real inheritance she left me, more than the house itself, more than the furniture or the rose bushes or the recipe card still tucked in that kitchen drawer. She left me the quiet certainty that a woman does not need to be the loudest voice in the room to be the one who ends up holding the deed. I think, too, about all the years before this one, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday phone calls where I quietly absorbed comments I told myself did not matter, and I do not regret the patience of those years. Not entirely, because that patience is also part of who I am. But I no longer confuse patience with disappearing. I no longer believe that keeping the peace requires me to keep quiet about my own worth. I am 74 years old, and it took me until this year to understand that dignity is not something other people give you permission to have. It is something you quietly, patiently, and firmly claim for yourself, the same way I claim those keys off that dining room table without raising my voice, without needing anyone else's approval to know exactly what I had earned through an entire lifetime of careful, unglamorous, underestimated work. Whatever your own version of that table looks like, I hope you find your own moment to set your keys down, too. Thank you so much for sitting with me tonight and listening to this old woman's story all the way through. If it moved you even a little, please subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who might need to hear it, maybe someone who has been made to feel small at their own family's table for far too long. It does not cost a thing, and it helps this little corner of the internet keep telling stories like mine. I'll see you next time, and until then, take care of yourself, and never let anyone convince you that quiet means small.